Small group. Thank you all for being here on the Sunday morning, the last day. A lot of people are flying out, but so we appreciate you being here. We're just talking through a couple of different projects, both from the global north and the global south, and different ways of incorporating similar theories to look at intra-minority relationships. So first, Michele will be talking for a little bit, and then I'll be talking, and then Rashmi was actually video conferencing in. She's in India right now, so very fortunate to be able to have her actually present with you all. There will be a Q&A session. We have time for about one question after each presentation, and we can reserve any other time at the end for more. And again, you can ask Rashmi questions too, because she can hear everything we're saying right now. So we can go ahead and get started, especially since we're running a couple minutes late. I want to make sure there's enough time for everybody. So Curious is up here already.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Michele Toiley. I'm a fourth going to fifth year PhD student at Clark University. I'm presenting on a project that I did with another grad student, Julia Tran, on intra-minority solidarity. Specifically, we were interested in looking at how intergroup contacts, so intergroup contacts in relation to minority contact with majority, as well as minority contact with another minority group, facilitates ally activism. So I will give a brief overview of the intergroup contact literature. A lot of us know actually quite a bit about the intergroup contact theory, so I'm not going to go too much into detail, but we know that for a long time, there was the assumption that positive intergroup contacts actually facilitates improved intergroup relations because it allows for the reduction in prejudice. And this is because intergroup contact allows for us to learn more about the outgroup, allows the group to have emotional ties to the other group, and also allows you to change your perspectives about a group that you potentially had negative beliefs about. So intergroup contact was seen to be a positive thing because it facilitates the reduction of prejudice. But one thing that we found out later on, actually maybe like 10 years ago, researchers found out that that was actually for majority group members contact with minority group members, but we weren't sure what intergroup contact did for minority group contact. So just to summarize, what used to be found was that positive contact led to, in relation to collective action, it led to increased collective action because it improved the outgroup attitudes for majority group members. But for minority group members, that's where things got a little bit complicated because instead of having that positive effect, it actually led to a reduction in collective action because in relation to collective action for the in-group. So minority group members, for example, if African Americans had positive contact with white Americans, they were less likely to engage in collective action for the in-group in order to improve the status of the group because it led to an increase in out-group attitudes. So as I say, this has primarily been done in relation to majority-minority relations, but we don't really know that much about what contact is for minority group members, especially in such a diverse context like the United States. So that's basically what my project is about. So I'm going to try to figure out what intra-minority contact leads to. So research so there's been an increasing focus on intra-minority collective action, and people have tried to figure out what facilitates solidarity between minority group members, and this work has been done both in contexts like the US where there isn't that, where there's not necessarily intergroup violence, and also in contexts like, you know, like international contexts like Israel-Palestinian conflict where there's much more, you know, tense relations between groups. And they've tried to find out what leads one group to promote the well-being of another group, especially when they're minority groups. And they have found that there are basically two factors that lead to that. One of them is the perceived similarities or differences between groups. So work has shown that when minority groups perceive that there's a sense of similarity between them, or that their collective victimization, as we call it, is similar to what another group has experienced, they're more likely to engage in collective action on behalf of the other group. Also, if a group, especially if a majority group or a group that hasn't been victimized as much, sees that the group has suffered more than the other group, so the out group has suffered more than the in group, so the downward comparison, they're more likely to engage in collective action. And this especially has been done in settings with like heavy power differentials, like Israel Palestine, where if Israeli participants saw that the Palestinians had suffered more than them, they were more likely to engage in protest on behalf of Palestinians. But if they saw that they had suffered similarly, they were actually not likely to engage in protest. So we wanted to combine that in our study to see which of the two sort of perceptions of similarities and differences led to collective action. The other one is a sense of structural awareness, so the belief that the status differences that exist are actually unstable and illegitimate. And this has consistently been shown that when there's that sense of structural awareness, then minority groups are more likely to engage in collective action, both for the in-group as well as for the out-group, other minority groups. So the present study basically asks that question, like what is the role of positive contact with another minority group versus majority group on ally activism? And we studied this question in the context of Asian-Black relations in the US. As you know, like the Asian Americans and Black Americans have had a very complicated history. We have many examples where Asian Americans as well as Black Americans engage in ally activism on behalf of the other group. But we also have examples where there's been a sense of competition between the groups. And this mostly is facilitated by the stereotypes that exist within the society for each group. And each of these stereotypes basically are there to maintain white supremacy, but you find that a lot of cases that even minority group members may integrate these stereotypes in their perception of the other minority group. Existing historical examples of this, where like there's been heavy competition between Asian Americans as well as African Americans, and more recently we have the example of affirmative action competition where there's sort of a pitting between Asian Americans and African Americans without looking at the complexity of what affirmative action is. So we try to ask the question about whether Asian Americans will be able to engage in collective action on behalf of African Americans, and whether that's predicted by intergroup contact, positive intergroup contact specifically. So our measures, as I say, there were Asian Americans living in the United States. They had to have been in the US for at least 3 years because we were trying to get US, people who are aware of the US context. They were heavily female. The education as well as the household income varied. And these are the measures that we use. I'm not sure if you can see them, but it's sort of like if you have any questions during the Q&A, we can go into more details about the specific measures that we used. So our first hypothesis was positive intergroup contact with African Americans will promote ally activism. And that was through improving intergroup, so outgroup attitudes, structural awareness, as well as the different perceptions of similarities and differences between the group. And this is the model. Sorry, I'll quickly explain it. So the results found, so this was actually a terrible model, as you can see. And the main reason was that the perceptions of similarities and differences actually were not correlating with a lot of the items. As you can see, the red line actually shows that there's no significant difference or there's no significant predictions, while the green line shows that there's a significant difference. So we were, in the end, we had to revise the model, and we removed all the perceptions of similarities and differences measures. And then this was the revised model. And here we find that actually our hypothesis was supported in the sense that positive contact with Blacks led to an increase in attitudes towards Blacks, which then increased past activism as well as support for affirmative action. And this was also the case through structural awareness. And the indirect effects were the same way where, this is the positive contact with Blacks, indirectly was predicted past activism as well as affirmative action, both through attitudes, positive, improving attitudes towards Blacks as well as structural awareness, and also directly through attitudes alone without structural awareness. So our first hypothesis was supported, and that was sort of like, it's in line with all the work that had been done when it comes to positive contact and the effects on outgroup attitudes and ally activism. But then we also asked the second hypothesis, which was, what is the effect of positive contact with white Americans on Asian Americans' ally activism on behalf of African Americans? And this is where it got a little bit complicated, where we found that positive contact with whites actually led to an increase in attitudes towards whites. But again, this model was not good because the what do you call them? The measures that look at perceptions of outgroup similarities and differences were not great. So we had to do the same thing where we removed them, and the model was improved. And this is where we find that it actually led to, at least the indirect effects, there was a decrease in ally activism as well as affirmative action when Asian Americans had positive contact with whites, because there was an improvement in attitudes towards whites and a reduction in structural awareness. And these are the indirect effects, like I mentioned. So as you can see, for both outcomes, so past activism as well as affirmative action, positive contact with whites led to a decrease in past activism, as well as ally activism, as well as support for affirmative action, because it increased attitudes towards white as well as reduced structural awareness. So what do we learn from this? Sorry if I've gone quickly, but I'm trying to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. So we learned that basically positive effects of contact can be generalized to intraminority contact, but these positive effects are only when it comes to intraminority contact, but not necessarily minority contact with a majority group member when it comes to ally activism and ally activism on behalf of another minority group. And again, this was mediated by intergroup contact as well as structural awareness. But this was not, but we were actually very curious to know why a lot of our measures that looked at perceived similarities and differences did not work out. And I think a lot of one of the reasons we think that was the case was we actually transferred a lot of the measures that had been done in like fraud context. So we had used these measures in the context of like Cypriot crisis, so the ethnic Cypriots as well as the Turks in Cyprus. We had used the same measures in Israel-Palestinian conflicts. We had used it in different contexts in Eastern Europe, and these measures did not translate really well when it came to the context of the U.S. intraminority relations. And that's because we were focusing on similarities in suffering instead of similarities in like what are the differences in advantage, and we think that that's probably one of the reasons why that was the case. So we think that research in intergroup contact should definitely go beyond just looking at majority-minority contact, because that's not the reality that we are in right now. There are lots of minority group members interacting together, and we need to start focusing again on what minority interaction and solidarity looks like. So I would like to acknowledge my core research grad. We did this as our like side project, Julia and I, and we were very happy that we got a big response from the participants. It was a community sample, and we had a great number of undergraduate research assistants who helped us with this. So thank you very much.
We have time for one question.
Yeah. Yes.
This may be kind of a technical thing. I'm wondering why you chose to make the models in your SEM model manifest instead of latent. It looked like, based on the way that it was modeled in there, that there were manifest variables.
Yeah, it was mostly a power thing. We had like 200 participants. If we were going to make them into latent variables, we needed to have much more power. And it was a community sample. It took us 1.5 years to recruit. So we just decided we will create them as manifest. We would create them, as manifest variables instead of latent variables. But but we also like this. A lot of the items that we used had been there were like 3 or 4 items in each of the measures. And we ended up having to, like for the competitive victimhood, for example, we ended up having to look at the reliability, and it was really poor. So we chose like the items that were strongly. So we found ways of creating manifest variables that were actually interrelated in order to reduce the error. But a lot of it just had to do with power. We were tired of, we had spent 1.5 years recruiting, and we needed to stop. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So hello, my name is Jaboa Lake, and I'm a rising 5th year also at Portland State University. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about 2 different studies, one that's a very recent pilot, but one that was done a couple of years ago on just general intraminority support for and participation in race-based collective action movements. So due to really high-profile police shootings, collective action movements, just like the Black Lives Matter movement, have really come to the forefront of societal discourse and concern. So these actions are directly addressing use of force against Black people. A number of non-Black racial minorities have declared solidarity with this movement. And women of color specifically have played a really important role when it comes to both historical and current social movements that address racial bias in policing. And we can think of things like the Black Panther Party. There was a lot of women leadership in those cases, though that's not always what we think of when we think of leadership. And so from this and other examples, we can kind of see the contributions that women of color specifically make to the mobilization of racial justice movements. So we're seeing both here, kind of this solidarity between minority groups, but we're also seeing this historical context where even within racial minority groups, there may be gender differences in both support for and participation in collective action. So to briefly go over the literature, since Michelle did talk about some of the similar stuff, targets of racial bias respond to their group-based disadvantage in various different ways, including engagement with collective action and social movements. And some social movements themselves are just a product of a group of collective actions that are then enacted and organized by groups. So they're more rare. Collective actions can, of course, be in the moment or happen once and then never again. Social movements are things that need more sustainability, but yet are the ones that are often making those structural changes. And again, going back to the Black Lives Matter movement specifically as a network, it's example of a current social movement that pushes for policy change and increased police accountability. And this stemmed from a series of collective actions that happened and then became an organization and became a larger social movement. So though these movements and actions are directly addressing police use of force against Black people, there have been over 100 racial minority organizations that have declared solidarity with this movement. So we are seeing a lot of support outside of just the Black community for this specific issue. And then going back to thinking about gender, again, there's a lot of current social psychological literature that focuses on intergroup attitudes and relations between majority and minority group members, such as those between white and Black people, but there's a lot less literature that we know about between intraminority alliances and coalitions, such as between Black and Latinx people. And these more minority relationships kind of differ at their core than minority-majority relationships and attitudes, because even though each racial minority group is distinct, a collective self-representation and shared minority status can then activate feelings of common identity, collective disadvantage and victimhood, and inclusive victim consciousness. And each of these can induce more positive attitudes about interminority coalition building and engagement in joint collective action. So though taking into account these really domain-specific identities as they relate to a particular social cause or movement is essential, it's also really important to consider intra-group diversity and how that may further help explain who engages specifically in these collective actions and movements towards social change. So the term intersectionality, just very briefly, was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, that we can credit people like Sojourner Truth, who spoke about it, hundreds of years before her, or 100 years before her. And those social psychology research is really taking a lot of steps to increase intersectional thinking in research. And there is a lot of research on the rise. There's still a lot of significant improvements that can be made when thinking about theories and models and the way that they may not equally fit for people who have different multiple marginalized identities. And so research on social activism specifically usually takes a singular identity approach. Past collective action movements primarily address issues directed at prototypical group members. So for example, Black issues tend to be Black men issues, women's issues tend to be white women's issues. So these prototypical members tend to be the ones who are being addressed in these social movements. However, these movements affect people with a lot of different types of identities that aren't just the prototypical group members. And sometimes it means that if you are not a prototypical group member and yet there's a movement that's not directly addressing you, you may be more motivated to get involved with that movement so that you can see yourself represented in that. So these examples can call attention to the need to consider the intersections of both race and gender in racial movement context, rather than just taking a singular identity approach to understanding political participation and collective action. So this is one focus of the data that I'll show you in just a little bit. So for study one, we collected data from, there was a total of about 650 undergraduate students that took an online survey. For this analysis, I'm only using about 500 people, and that's because there were a lot of people who identified as transgender and non-binary or racial minority outside of the groups that I'll be presenting. Unfortunately, there weren't enough numbers to be able to include them because the power was just too low. So unfortunately, I can't look at some other specific groups that are represented in the data that we collected. The mean age, even though they were students, was almost 26 years old. This comes from a university with a large population of non-traditional students. So there are a lot of veterans, there are a lot of commuters, there are a lot of parents, which kind of makes it more representative and a little bit more generalizable to the general population. And the racial groups that I'll be looking at are Asian people, Black people, Latinx people, and white people. And then gender groups were men and women. This sample was predominantly white women, so that's something to think about. And I'll talk about power in just a little bit also, but what I'm really focusing on are the differences between racial minority groups. So there are two outcome measures that I was really focusing on, and they were both support for protests in the Black Lives Matter movement and then participation. So not just these attitudinal, like, yeah, I support this, I'm in solidarity, but also these attitudes and this self-reported participation in protests in the Black Lives Matter movement. Because it was so recent at the time, this data started being collected in 2015, kind of right after the movement was created. So we created our own scale. It was 7 items, and it asked things like, I support the Black Lives Matter movement. The protests in response to the shooting of Michael Brown and similar cases are effective in promoting social change. And even though this isn't a validated scale, we run an EFA and a CFA, and all 7 items loaded under one under one construct, and the alpha level was like 0.94, so it was actually pretty strong. So I feel pretty confident in using these items. And then the participation protest was just one item, and it was on a 1 to 5, not at all or extremely. How much were you personally involved in any of the protest efforts for Michael Brown or similar cases? So this item is very broad. Participation can look like a lot of different things. We can think about like online participation, protesting, getting involved in an organization, but just kind of getting this first start at looking at this, these issues in this construct, we just kind of left it open like that. So first, looking at race and gender and the intersection of race and gender differences in support for the Black Lives Matter movement and protest, we see main effects for both race and gender. We didn't see an interaction effect where, you know, we're looking at these intersecting identities, but the power you can see is like really, really low for this test. So there's not much that, I mean, the significance level is also not great, but the power was so low that I don't know how much we can say about that. And that's just because the sample had such, you know, it was really hard to recruit racial minority students. But when we're looking a little bit more closely at support for protest and BLM by race in itself, we see that Black people were the more supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that there was no difference between any other group, though there was a marginally difference between white and Asian people. And this is kind of aligns with a lot of the past literature that does show that, you know, you're more likely to engage with issues that are relevant to your own group. So this wasn't unexpected at all. And then looking at gender differences, we do see that women are more supportive overall of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests than men were. And then breaking it down a little bit further, looking at, you know, gender differences within each racial minority group, what we were thinking about was that within each racial minority group, women would be more supportive and participate more in the Black Lives Matter movement, thinking about how multiple marginalized identities may make them, you know, understand certain structures a little bit more. And we only saw differences for white and Latinx people. So both for white and Latinx people, women were more supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement than men were. We didn't see differences for Black people, which makes a little bit of sense because it still isn't something that's particular to their own group. So there wasn't as much variance there. And there were no differences between Asian men and women, yet their variance was much larger, because it looks like that would be significant, but it actually wasn't, because there was just so much more variance within that particular group, which can speak to a lot of things too. We did have a category for people who are identified as Middle Eastern, so they weren't included in this Asian category, but we can think about the diversity within the Asian identity that may contribute to some of the higher variance there. And then looking at the other outcome, self-reported participation, so these behaviors that people are engaging in, we did see a main effect for both race and gender and an interaction effect, so that was significant as we predicted. And then looking specifically just at race, we see a similar pattern where Black people were reporting higher levels of participation in the Black Lives Matter movement than any other group, and other groups didn't differ. One thing that is kind of interesting, well, first of all, the reported participation is very low, and you can see that support was much higher than that. So there's kind of a conversation that could be had about people's level of actual like attitudes and support versus their behaviors and actions. And I'll talk a little bit more about both motivations versus and barriers in just a little bit. One thing that is particularly interesting, though, is that when it came to attitudes and support for the Black Lives Matter movement, Asian people were actually reporting the lowest levels, but when it comes here to participation, you can see it trends kind of the opposite way. They're slightly higher than other groups. I mean, it's not significant, it was approaching significance, but it's still something to think about. It's not trending in the same way. And then looking at gender group differences, we see a marginal effect of women reporting higher participation in the Black Lives Matter movement and racial protests than men. And then breaking it down again by race and gender, we see with white people, which is not really the concern I'm having because there's a lot of nuance there that isn't captured in intra-minority relations. White women are reporting more participation than white men in the Black Lives Matter movement, but within Black people themselves, so this group that is, you know, the movement is directly addressing, there is a marginal difference in and Black women reporting higher levels of participation in the Black Lives Matter movement than Black men. And, you know, it's just marginal, but there was so much variance here because there were very, very few non-Black people who reported levels of 4 or 5 of participation, like these higher levels, but within Black people, there was just a lot more variance going up and down. Some people that said not at all, a lot of people that were in the middle, a lot of people that were a little bit higher. So that's also something to think about. But even with that variance, we see that Black women are reporting higher levels of participation. So just to summarize, we did see these main effects of both gender and race, with women reporting higher levels of support and participation, and Black people reporting more support and participation, which is to be expected, but not really any differences being found between Latinx, Asian, and white people. There was some that were either marginal or approaching marginal, so it just kind of calls to the need for a higher sample size to really tease those apart. And then when we were looking at intersecting identities for white and Latinx people, for support, we saw, differences between gender within race, and then for white and Black people, we saw differences between gender within race for participation. And then a question that I was also very interested in was looking at a lot of these very classic social psychological predictors of both intergroup attitudes and collective action, and the idea that in specific contexts, different things may predict collective action intentions and behaviors for different group members. And when we're looking at intra-minority relationships, we can think about a lot of models for collective action that may not be accurately applied, because they're often kind of based on own group collective action or type of kind of allyship collective action, which is based in majority group members, activism for minority group members. So I kind of wanted to just explore a lot of these classic variables that we're looking at and see if they're actually accurately predicting or predicting collective action in the same ways. So the survey that this data came from asked about a lot of things, asked about attitudes about police, arming security on campus, but it also asked about, protests, attitudes towards protests and things like that. We also had them fill out the modern racism scale, awareness of privilege and oppression, social dominance orientation, and beliefs in a just world. And we wanted to look at all 4 of these to kind of see how they're acting and which ones are actually significant in predicting support for racial protests in the Black Lives Matter movement. So looking at, first of all, there's different things that are predicting support for the Black Lives Matter movement depending on racial minority group. For Black people, only awareness of privilege and oppression and social dominance orientation were associated with support for the Black Lives Matter movement, which is different than Latinx people, where only modern racism and awareness of oppression and privilege predicted support. And then for Asian people, only modern racism was the predictor. So, social dominance orientation, just world beliefs, and awareness of privilege and oppression weren't significant in predicting their support at all. So you can see these differences between the groups and the types of attitudes or things that may be influencing, attitudes towards solidarity, other groups, and collective action. And then for just world beliefs, the white people were the only ones that was significant for. So it's really, it both kind of confirmed my suspicions that, there are different things going on from different groups because there are very unique relationships that these groups are having within each other. And by identifying both these racial group differences, these results suggest, that possible predictors for intra-minority solidarity and coalition building for collective action change efforts. And so it's kind of just suggesting that we may need to be looking at different types of models and approaches when looking at intra-minority solidarity, specifically in different contexts, instead of applying, the things that we think we know, because it hasn't been looked at in these contexts. And then I'm going to very briefly, because I don't want to go too far, very briefly talk about study 2. So I actually just finished collecting this data last weekend. So I'm going to really just go over some highlights from somewhat things that were being found. So there hasn't been a lot of qualitative data being collected on intra-minority attitudes. And what I'm particularly interested in are people who identify as activists and organizers. So the first study, the quantitative part, was asking just general people, not people who particularly identified with a movement, but I was interested in people who are active, racial minorities who are active in racial justice movements. What are their perceptions of intra-minority coalition building between different groups? So I did 6 semi-structured interviews, and this was some pilot data, so we're testing out the questions still and going to hopefully expand later, but we still had 6, which is a good number to start with. And they just range from 45 to 65 minutes because it was a slightly shorter script. And again, these were racial minorities who had previously or currently engaged with race-based collective or community organizing. And the script asked questions about their motivations and process of becoming involved, how they defined allyship and solidarity. We asked them about individual and group-based actions in terms of the other groups, so that's kind of the intra-minority coalition building parts. And we also asked them about barriers to individual engagement and cross-cultural engagement, which is very interesting, but I won't be talking about too much. So I'll be really focusing on this third question because it's most relevant to this talk right now. So I'm going to talk about just some of the themes that were popping up in a lot of the interviews that are kind of informing what we thought we knew about theory anyway. And one was the emphasis on community building. So when we're asking people about their, their perceptions of coalition building between racial minority groups for social change, a lot of people really emphasized the fact that community building was what was driving a lot of it. So for example, if there's no community building, I don't know how I'm supposed to show up. I could Google it, but to me, it's not the same as having an actual relationship. And then having those face-to-face interactions leads me to be curious and to just seek understanding of other folks. And then another big theme that was coming up was understanding of structures and histories, and this kind of lends to the awareness of oppression and privilege, and literally just awareness of different structures and histories. And people that were interviewed really emphasized that that was important, and understanding different groups' histories was really important to their engagement with cross-cultural organizing. But their histories are not connected in conversation with each other and understood as kind of happening at the same time, not being informed by each other. To recognize that there are issues that affect people differently, it's important to recognize the ways in which things disproportionately and people experience things differently. And another person said, many of it, actually all of it, has been identity-based work, like understanding imperialism and colonialism as it relates to all of the things, and that they that was their motivations for cross-cultural organizing, by recognizing these larger systems that that affected many groups, marginalized groups. And then the last thing that I'll just very briefly talk about is emphasizing common identity. And this is something that's very large, in intergroup attitude relationships, but also in collective action. We can look at the common in-group identity model, which says that, if you have a common overarching identity, but you also really appreciate those individual group-based identities at the same time, that can foster collective action. And that was kind of reflected in some of the quotes from these interviews. I'm not free until everyone is free. Like, it may not be affected firsthand, but that's still injustice within a community that I live in. That's just injustice that I don't want within the community that I live in. That's why I want to be involved. And then another one was, in terms of being a racial minority, I mean, I experience it, but I don't know what it's like for other groups. I'm never going to be anything besides Latina. And then she went on to talk about how that is still a motivator for her to be involved. So kind of recognizing that there is a common group, and that, she understands some things, but at the same time, she recognizes that her experience is unique and her group-based experience is unique. So some implications from this work, it really just gives some new insights on intra-minority relations and solidarity, and specifically within a specific movement. And even though that may not be generalizable across other movements, it's still important to look at what's going on there, especially since the Black Lives Matter movement is such a prominent movement right now, and it gets so much attention. It also addresses different intergroup differences and looks at people with multiple marginalized identities and kind of how their attitudes and their behaviors may be different. And it lends to a deeper understanding of public responses to police use of force cases from the first study. So just getting a little bit more into how are people actually thinking about these cases, what are their attitudes towards it, and this can then improve community police relations, because it's giving a little bit more information on where the community is coming from, how they're perceiving things, and where their support lies. And then most importantly for me, because I identify as an organizer and I come from an organizer background, I think that there's a lot of application for community organizers, along with policymakers and researchers, both in program and intervention development. We can take some of these themes that we're seeing and see if there's a need for a specific type of program, such as a political education program or group-based activities, and use those to foster intergroup coalition building. To then further engage people in cross-cultural organizing. And it can also be used to develop more community-informed policy and social change efforts by actually knowing what the community is perceiving and how they're approaching these different topics. So thank you. I went a little long, so I'm going to hold questions for myself until Rashmi has a chance to finish her presentation.
Rashmi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. I think
Great.
you can start. Hold on. How do I minimize this? All right. The next talk will be by Dr. Rashmi Nair. She's actually based in India right now. She was not able to come. So I will be switching over slides as she talks.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I am sorry I couldn't be there in person due to some visa issues, but I'm happy to be able to join you virtually. As many of you might know, social psychological research on intergroup relations has largely focused on majority-minority relations, while minority-minority relations remain largely understudied. Moreover, the scarce research on minority-minority relations has taken a singular approach, meaning researchers have focused on single identity groups like race, ethnicity, or gender in their analyses. More recently, however, a few researchers have begun to critique this approach, and they have called for an intersectional examination of minority-minority relations. My research is a step in this direction, and in my talk today, I will share findings on some beliefs linked with intersecting identities that can shape coalition between minorities, and I'll also explain the implications for policymakers. Next slide, please. Broadly speaking, the scarce research on minority-minority relations has highlighted some important social psychological factors that can shape relations between them. For instance, researchers have examined how the presence of majority group members may influence minority-minority relations. But relatively lesser remains known about the role of social psychological beliefs related to experiences of group-based victimization or collective disadvantage, namely victim beliefs, and these are presumably very important to explore when examining relations between disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most studied belief linked with experiences of collective victimization is that of competitive victimhood, wherein some members of minority groups may compete over claims of greater victimhood. Competitive victimhood has been found to predict negative intergroup outcomes. For example, in Chile, Noor and colleagues found that competitive victimhood negatively predicted outgroup forgiveness. However, there are some important gaps in this literature on victim beliefs. First of all, majority of this research has used quantitative methods, meaning we don't know how people themselves think and talk about their group's victimization. Moreover, this research has thus far taken a singular approach. Singular approaches are those in which researchers focus on single identity groups such as race, ethnicity, or gender for their analyses. Next slide, please. The intersectionality framework was put forth by Black feminists precisely as an antidote to these single identity approaches. And they argued that it was important to account for the advantages and disadvantages associated with multiple intersecting identities, such as that of race, class, and gender in their analyses. While much of the work on intersectionality is rooted in women's studies, recently some psychologists have drawn upon the tenets of intersectionality to inform processes that can shape intergroup relations. One such belief is that of intersectional consciousness, which refers to people's awareness of intersectional differences. Just to give an example, some white women may be aware of the differences in their privileges linked with their intersection when compared to the intersectional experiences of women of color. Next slide, please. When tested amongst white women, Greenwood and Christian found that intersectional consciousness predicted positive attitudes between white women and Muslim women. And this was done in Scotland. Yet there are some important gaps in this literature. Research on intersectional consciousness has mainly focused on perceptions of privileges in relation to intersecting identities. whereas beliefs of disadvantages associated with intersecting identities remain underexplored. Moreover, because this work has used quantitative methods, we don't know how group members themselves think and talk about these experiences linked with their intersecting identities. And finally, this work remains confined to the West. In my research, I address these gaps and I examine how group members think about the advantages as well as disadvantages linked with their intersecting identities that may shape minority-minority relations, and I look at this in the understudied context of India. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of the context, the Hindus form the vast majority of India's population. They're about 80% of India's population. However, far from being homogeneous, the Hindu majority is divided by the caste system, which privileges the so-called upper caste people while disadvantaging the so-called lower caste people, or Dalits as they refer to themselves. You can see the blue triangle there that can give you a sense of the caste hierarchy that's in India. And Dalits form about 16% of India's population, and they are specifically tied to certain jobs such as cleaning sewers and leather tanning. And at the same time, they also face practices of untouchability, which is legitimized by the caste system. Another disadvantaged community in India is that of Muslims, who form about 15% of India's population. Muslims have been marginalized both in the public and private sphere. At the same time, owing to historical animosity with the Hindu majority group, they have suffered large-scale communal riots. In recent years, moreover, some Dalits have been instigated by some upper caste Hindu fundamentalist organization to go and attack Muslims on their behalf. So there have been conflicts between Dalits and Muslims. Moreover, there's discrepancy in affirmative action rights between them, and it presents another source of tension between Dalits and Muslims. Specifically, while Dalits are given access to affirmative action rights, Muslims are largely denied these rights. So against this backdrop, however, there have also been instances of solidarity between these groups. Yet little remains known about beliefs linked with experiences of collective victimization that can shape relations between these minorities. And particularly, we don't know how beliefs linked with their intersecting identities can shape relations between them. Next slide, please. Therefore, in my research, I ask, what are some beliefs linked with intersecting identities that can shape relations between these minorities? Specifically, I wanted to examine the intersection of their religious and caste identity with that of gender and class. Drawing upon the framework of intersectionality, I designed a two-part study. Study 1 focused on middle-class Dalits and Muslims, both men and women, while Study 2 focused on Dalits and Muslims, men and women from lower income backgrounds. Next slide, please. As part of Study 1, I conducted 33 individual interviews amongst approximately an equal number of Dalit and Muslim men and women from middle-class backgrounds. To be able to reach them more easily, I used individual interviews with this group. Towards Study 2 that focused on Dalits and Muslims from a lower income background, I used focus group discussions, and I used this format to reduce the power differences that can be more pronounced during an individual interview. I recruited participants for the study using a combination of snowball and maximum variation sampling in the city of New Delhi. And amongst other issues, the main questions in the interview asked the participants to make comparisons of intersectional experiences across the group. So to give a few examples, I asked Dalit women to compare their experiences with that of Muslim women. Similarly, I asked middle-class Muslims to compare their experiences. One second. Similarly, I asked middle-class Muslims to compare their experiences with middle-class Dalits. The data was analyzed using a combination of inductive and deductive thematic analyses. Next slide, please. And the analyses revealed various ways in which people expressed intersectional consciousness or an awareness of intersectional differences. Next slide, please. To begin with, in line with past research on intersectional consciousness, some people expressed an awareness of intersectional differences in terms of privilege. To give an example, when asked to compare the experiences of Muslim women and Dalit women, a Muslim woman said, "In comparison with Muslim women, Dalit women have to suffer more. They have to suffer more on the basis of caste discrimination, because you know that it is said about them that they don't maintain cleanliness, that a Dalit woman does not maintain personal hygiene, that she is dirty. These things are not applicable to Muslim women." So in this example, we see that this Muslim woman expresses a sense of intersectional privilege when comparing her experiences with Dalit women. Building on past research on intersectional consciousness that has tested these beliefs of intersectional privilege amongst white women, these beliefs may entail positive intergroup outcomes for relations between different intersections. Next slide, please. In contrast to these beliefs of privilege, some people expressed intersectional consciousness in terms of comparative victimhood. In other words, they expressed claims of greater suffering when comparing their intersectional experiences. For example, when asked to compare the situation of poor Muslims and poor Dalits, a poor Muslim woman said, "They, the poor Dalits, get support from the government. All the cleaning jobs are theirs and they have affirmative action rights." You might remember I had mentioned that while Dalits are given access to affirmative action rights, Muslims are largely denied these rights. So she says that they have access to affirmative action rights. "We don't even get the work to clean the streets and they get to take home salaries. What about us?" So in this example, we see that this woman argues that poor Muslims are worse off than poor Dalits and expresses a sense of intersectional comparative victimhood. Although such beliefs of comparative victimhood have not been identified in relation to intersecting identities yet, research on comparative victimhood using a singular approach shows that they predict negative intergroup outcomes. Presumably, such beliefs of comparative victimhood with respect to intersectional experiences may also entail similar negative intergroup outcomes. Next slide, please. And finally, I found that some participants expressed intersectional consciousness in terms of qualitative differences. In other words, they did not engage in upward comparisons that underlie beliefs of comparative victimhood or downward comparisons that shaped construals of privilege, but highlighted the unique experiences of different intersections in a way that acknowledged the suffering of both these intersections. Just to give an example, when asked to compare the experiences of middle-class Muslims and middle-class Dalits, a middle-class Dalit man said, "They are different. Middle-class Dalits still experience untouchability being a Dalit. But if somebody is a middle-class Muslim, they will not have this experience. They have different types of problems. Like if they wear a prayer cap or a beard, then people look at them strangely. But that is a different issue." So in this example, we see that this middle-class Dalit man, he highlights the unique suffering faced by members at both these intersections without necessarily engaging in upward or downward comparisons. While little remains known about these perceptions of qualitative difference, drawing upon the broader scholarship on intersectionality, it is possible that these beliefs may entail positive intergroup outcomes as they entail acknowledgement of the suffering of both intersections. Next slide, please. So to sum up, the analyses revealed three ways in which participants expressed intersectional consciousness. First, some participants expressed an awareness of privilege over other intersections when comparing their intersectional experiences. These beliefs may predict positive intergroup outcomes. Second, some participants mentioned qualitative differences in intersectional differences when comparing the experiences of different intersections. These beliefs may also be linked with positive intergroup outcomes. And finally, some participants made claims of greater victimhood or comparative victimhood when comparing their intersectional experiences. These beliefs may be linked with negative intergroup outcomes. And the main takeaway of this study and these findings is that these beliefs linked with intersecting identities can serve as additional sources of tension and solidarity between minorities, along with the beliefs linked with singular identities. Next slide, please. These findings can inform the work of policymakers and upcoming policymakers in some important ways. In India, the next general elections are lined up either towards the end of this year or in the year 2019. And considering that together Dalits and Muslims form about 30% of India's population, there have been attempts to polarize these communities for electoral benefits by a right-wing political party which is currently in power. Against this backdrop, however, there have been some leaders, some political leaders, who have been trying to build solidarity between these communities. And the picture that you see on the slide is two such leaders who are trying to build solidarity between these groups. The woman on the left is Shaila Rashid, and she is preparing to run for parliamentary elections. She has been outspoken on the victimization faced by various communities, including Muslims. And similar is the case with Jignesh Mevani, who is the man on the right. He is a state level policymaker, and he has been doing excellent work advocating for the rights of Dalits and other marginalized communities. Now, political leaders such as them, who are working to build solidarity between Dalits and Muslims, can draw on these findings to improve relations between them. Specifically, they can use these expressions of intersectional privilege and qualitative difference to try and draw these communities closer together. What this would do, hopefully, would be that this can help them consolidate the votes of Dalits and Muslims to support candidates that speak for the rights of marginalized groups. At the same time, these policymakers or upcoming policymakers should be careful to avoid expressions of comparative victimhood, which can create tensions between these communities and split the votes between different candidates. Next slide, please. In addition to these practical implications for policymakers, this research also makes some important theoretical contributions. First, this research integrates work on victim beliefs and intersectional consciousness that had thus far examined group-based disadvantage and collective victimization separately. Secondly, it extends the scarce research on intersectional consciousness to the understudied context of India. And thirdly, this research sheds light on minority-minority relations from an intersectional perspective. Next slide, please. And with that, I want to wrap up. A big thank you to the participants in my study, my advisor, research assistants who helped me with the study, and funders who supported this research, including Spitzy. Many thanks to Michele for operating the slides. And now I think we can just open the floor to any questions or comments that you may have.
Does anyone have any questions for Rashmi? And then for any of us.
All right. Any questions for Rashmi, for Jaboa, for myself? We can open up this discussion.
I can ask a question of Rashmi. Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering, since you mentioned the elections coming up, if you would predict based on the outcome of the elections any sort of differences in understanding of intersectional, I'm going to use the wrong words, but intersectional, empathy, sympathy, or even more competitiveness or less based on what comes out of the elections?
Yeah. So the elections, to be very honest, the elections look a little bit grim. We are expecting the right-wing government to be back in power. Having said that, we are hoping that we would be able to elect at least a few progressive policymakers in the parliament, and that the kind of majority that they had in both houses of the parliament, we'd be able to reduce that to some extent. If we are able to do that, I think we would be able to some extent, build intersectional relationships between different communities better. Hopefully, we would be able to elect people like Shehla, for instance. I mean, she's somebody who speaks about these issues from an intersectional perspective, where she not only understands, of course, issues of religious identity-based targeting, but also gender-based discrimination and violence that's taking place in India. So, if we are able to elect people like that, hopefully we would have lesser intersectional issues, because people like her, we hope, would be able to bridge the gap or bridge different intersections within different communities. What has been going on, however, if we, and I think we are probably going to end up with the right-wing government that we do have right now. If we do end up with them, which is very likely going to be the case, we are going to see more intersectional competitive behavior. So just to give you an example, one of the issues that they have very recently taken up is that of triple talaq, and I can explain what that is to you. Uh, uh, Amongst Muslims, there is a practice of triple talaq, where men can say the word talaq or divorce 3 times, and that's the end of their marriage. Now, of course, that's problematic, and Muslim women have been talking about this for a really long time. But when the right-wing government came about, they took up this issue in a way that showed Muslim men to be the sole perpetrators of the victimization faced by Muslim women, as though Hindus were not involved in the victimization, and also as though Hindu women were not victimized. So we might see uh, strategies that aim to break apart communities and sort of pit intersections against each other. If we see the wrong kind of policymakers being elected. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any other question? Yes.
I have a question. In the first study that you ran, did you have any measures examining perceived lawfulness or perceived this? I know one of the themes that came up in the second study was this idea that even though they're not my group, I feel as if I belong to the movement. So I think that would be.
Yeah, there's nothing about how much people perceive. There's nothing about how much people perceive their groups overlapping, and I'm actually really interested in that. I'm designing a couple studies that look at that exactly, how much they, there's the inclusion of the other in the self scale, which is moving to people, but I'm looking at that. I want to look at that within the group level. So how much do you include the other group in your own? Unfortunately for this study, it was already like a 20-minute long survey, and we were measuring so many things that we had to take some of that out. It's something that's really interesting. We did have feeling thermometers, so it's not quite at that, but it gets a little bit more at attitudes between different groups rather than, just the modern racism scale, which is really, anti-blackness when it comes down to it. But yeah, there were those belonging measures, but that is something definitely that is coming out in the qualitative piece with all of the talk about people emphasizing community and relationships with other people, and using those relationships to both know how to act, but also how to learn about certain issues. So one thing that I did ask about too was how people got information about social movements or issues that they were interested in, and then I asked about their process of becoming involved. So not just are you interested in this, and then also barriers for the ones that people weren't being involved in. And a lot of times people said they turned to social media to learn, which is another topic and a very interesting one. But they also said that, by having friends or building community with other people from different groups, they were able to learn about issues from like a first-hand perspective, or somebody had a different analysis, and then they were better informed as somebody building coalition progress in solidarity with them. And some of the barriers that people did talk about were, I didn't know a lot about this issue, I didn't know who to turn to, so I just didn't do anything at all. I didn't want to act wrong or make the problem worse. So yeah, the quality of stuff lends to that, but we didn't have any.
Yes.
Michelle, I actually have a question for you. When you, in your study, when you find,
Yeah, please increase your volume. I don't know if, yeah. So that Rashmi can hear, yeah.
So, do you, having positive contact between Asians and Blacks, critics, engagement and allyship, essentially, do you think that there would be a secondary transfer effect also, like we see in the contact literature? Would that also extend then to having positive contact with one minority group extending to positive, like in allyship with another minority group struggle is not involved in that dialogue.
Yeah, I suspect that that would be the case, especially if the contact with minority group is sort of looked at beyond just the specific minority group that you have contact with, but you see them as members of a global group of minorities. Especially when you're looking at not just identity-based membership, but similarities in experiences of disadvantage within the context that you're in. So sort of similar to what Rashmi was talking about, then I would see that it would extend beyond other minority groups. We were specifically looking at Asian and Black relations specifically, because when we think about minority groups that have specifically been disadvantaged in the US, at least within the current socio-political context, Asians are not usually highlighted, but we wanted to see if there's a sense of like solidarity between both groups. But we do suspect that there's secondary, especially if it goes beyond seeing the group as just a member of that particular group, but as a member of a minority group member, and having shared similarities of disadvantage within the global US context. Yeah. But that's a good question, and it's something that we would have liked to explore, but again, we were kind of limited. But we are trying to design a study too where we actually flip it and look at specifically African Americans' contact with Asian Americans and how that affects ally activism on behalf of Asian Americans. But we will include other groups within that as well. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
That's pretty much it.
That's pretty, yeah.
Anyway, so thank you all again for being here on this. Extra thank you to Rashmi for videoing and still being excited about it.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm really glad I was able to do this.
Yeah.
And then thank you for Cindy for setting up the tag.
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Rashmi. It's good to see your face. Talk to you later.
Talk later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Jaboa.
Bye. It's good to have us.